The morning arrived the way it always did, with Sophie's small voice cutting through the darkness like a blade. Nathaniel Sterling opened his eyes to find his 7-year-old daughter standing beside his bed, brown curls tangled from sleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had lost an ear somewhere between grief and time. Her face carried that expression he'd learned to read in the 3 years since Catherine died, the nightmare look, the one where she called for her mother and nobody answered. He reached for her without speaking, pulled her onto the narrow bed, felt the familiar weight of her against his chest. The ceiling above them bore 37 cracks. He'd memorized every one during the sleepless nights when breathing felt like work and morning seemed impossible. 3 years, 1,095 days, and his daughter still counted loss in bad dreams. Sophie's fingers twisted in the fabric of his old t-shirt. Her breathing gradually slowed, syncing with his, the way it always did when fear gave way to the certainty that he was still here, still present, still refusing to vanish the way her mother had. The pale light crept through the cheap blinds of their apartment. March in the city meant cold mornings and the kind of gray that matched the color of survival. Nate closed his eyes and let himself have 5 more minutes before the day demanded he become functional again. When Sophie finally stirred, he kissed the top of her head and forced brightness into his voice. "Time to get ready for school, sweetheart." Their morning routine had the predictability of ritual. Oatmeal with brown sugar because it was cheap and filling. Sophie's backpack checked 3 times because she had a tendency to forget homework in the chaos of just being 7. The walk to the bus stop took 12 minutes, and Nate used every second to memorize her face, the way she skipped over sidewalk cracks, the sound of her laugh when she told him about the art project starting in class. "I'm going to paint you," she announced, her gap-toothed smile wide. "Ms. Rodriguez said we should paint someone we love." Nate crouched down as the yellow bus rounded the corner, bringing his eyes level with hers. "I'm honored. You're going to do great today, okay? And tonight we'll have pancakes for dinner to celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "Whatever happens. We always have something to celebrate." The lie tasted familiar. They celebrated survival, dressed it up as victory, pretended that making it through another day was triumph enough. Sophie didn't need to know that yet. Maybe she never would. She hugged him tight, her small arms fierce around his neck, and climbed onto the bus without looking back. Nate watched until the vehicle disappeared, then turned toward home with hands that had already started shaking. The interview was scheduled for 10. He began preparing at 7:30 because control over the uncontrollable world came only through meticulous preparation. The shower offered lukewarm water. The building's plumbing hadn't improved in the 3 years he'd lived here, and he shaved carefully around the scar on his jaw. The thin white line was a souvenir from the accident that had taken Catherine, a permanent reminder that some moments divided your entire life into before and after. His closet held one suit. 4 years old, purchased for Catherine's funeral, worn to every interview since. The fabric had started to shine at the elbows. The pants hung looser now than they had a year ago. Too many meals skipped too many nights when ensuring Sophie ate meant he didn't. But it was clean and pressed, and it was all he had. The tie presented the familiar problem. Navy blue with thin silver stripes, a gift from Catherine on their 5th anniversary. He'd worn it exactly once before she died. Now his hands trembled every time he tried to make the knot work. The silk slipped through his fingers, refused to cooperate, mocked him with its simplicity. "Get it together," he whispered to his reflection. "You can do this." But the question always followed, could he? The position at Ashford Ventures was 3 levels above anything he was qualified for on paper. He'd been piecing together existence with warehouse shifts and freelance bookkeeping, nothing that would impress a Fortune 500 company. The only reason he'd gotten the interview was Dr. Harrison Webb, his former professor, who'd personally recommended him to someone in Ashford's HR department. Nathaniel Sterling is the most naturally gifted analyst I've taught in 20 years. The recommendation letter had said that words Nate had read so many times he'd memorized them. His circumstances have prevented him from reaching his full potential, but given the opportunity, he will exceed every expectation. Nate wished he had even half that confidence. The tie still wouldn't cooperate. He left it hanging loose, grabbed his worn leather messenger bag, another artifact from his previous life as a graduate student with dreams, and headed for the subway. The ride downtown took 40 minutes. Nate spent it reviewing notes about Ashford Ventures, a privately held investment firm specializing in sustainable development projects, founded 15 years ago by Victoria Ashford after she left a prestigious position at Goldman Sachs. The company had a reputation for aggressive growth tempered by unusual ethical standards. They'd turned down lucrative deals over environmental concerns. They paid employees well above market rate. And Victoria Ashford herself was something of an enigma. Rarely photographed, never interviewed, known only through the company's results. Nate exited at Broad Street and stood for a moment staring up at the gleaming tower, 37 floors of glass and steel reflecting the morning sun like a beacon. He felt absurdly small standing before it, a warehouse worker in a funeral suit pretending he belonged in a world that had moved on without him. The security guard checked his ID and directed him to the 28th floor. The elevator was all glass and chrome, rising smoothly while offering a vertigo-inducing view of the city spreading out below. Nate focused on his breathing. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The technique his grief counselor had taught him for managing anxiety had become as automatic as walking. The doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it belonged in a modern art museum. Clean lines, subtle lighting, expensive without being ostentatious. Behind a curved desk sat a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant knot. "You must be Nathaniel Sterling." The warmth in her voice caught him off guard. "I'm Margaret. Welcome to Ashford Ventures. Thank you." He'd expected corporate coldness, practiced professionalism. This felt different. "You're a bit early, which is perfect. Can I get you some water?" "Coffee water would be great." She returned with a glass of crystal that probably cost more than his monthly grocery budget, along with a smile that seemed genuine. "The panel should be ready for you in about 10 minutes. Try to relax." "You're going to do wonderfully." Nate wanted to ask how she could possibly know that, but instead just nodded and took a seat in one of the impossibly comfortable chairs lining the waiting area. He sipped the water and tried not to catastrophize. This was just an interview. The worst outcome was rejection, and he was intimately familiar with that particular pain. The minutes crawled. Nate watched other employees move through the space with purpose, but without rush, engaged, but not stressed. There was something in the culture here, something he couldn't quite name but could feel in the air. People said good morning to each other and seemed to mean it. "Mr. Sterling." Margaret's voice pulled him from his observations. "They're ready for you now. Conference room B just down this hallway on your left." Nate stood, straightened his jacket, and remembered too late that his tie was probably still askew. He reached up to check it as he walked, but before he could fix it, he found himself standing before a glass door with Conference Room B etched into its surface. He could see them inside. 3 people seated at a long table. 2 men in their 40s reviewing documents. And her, Victoria Ashford. Nate recognized her from the single professional photo on the company website, but that image had failed to capture the presence she commanded even sitting still. She was reading something on a tablet, a slight frown of concentration on her face. Dark hair pulled back revealed sharp cheekbones and a jawline that spoke of strength. The charcoal gray suit was tailored perfectly elegant without being flashy. Nate's hand was on the door handle when Dr. Webb's final piece of advice echoed in his mind. "Be honest. Victoria Ashford has a legendary ability to detect artifice. Don't try to be who you think they want. Be exactly who you are." He took one more breath and opened the door. All 3 of them looked up. The 2 men smiled politely. Victoria's expression was harder to read, assessing intelligent, giving nothing away. "Mr. Sterling." One of the men stood extending his hand. "Patrick Brennan, VP of Finance. This is Michael Foster, our Environmental Impact Specialist. And this is Victoria Ashford. Pleasure to meet you all." Nate shook hands with each of them, surprised when Victoria also stood to offer hers. Her grip was firm, her skin warm, the contact brief but somehow significant. "Please have a seat." Victoria's voice was lower than he'd expected, with a hint of something that might have been amusement. Nate moved to the chair across from them, set his messenger bag on the floor, and tried to remember how to sit like a competent professional rather than a man whose life was held together with determination and duct tape. Thank you for meeting with us. Patrick opened the folder in front of him. Dr. Webb spoke very highly of you. We've reviewed your resume and your portfolio, and I have to say your analytical work is impressive. The coastal development project analysis in particular showed sophisticated understanding of risk assessment. Thank you. That was a theoretical model I developed for Dr. Webb's seminar on sustainable finance. I was exploring how traditional risk metrics often fail to account for long-term environmental impact. What made you interested in that particular angle? Victoria asked. It was the first time she'd spoken beyond the greeting, and Nate found himself looking directly at her. Personal experience. I grew up in a town that prioritized short-term economic gain over environmental stewardship. By the time I was in high school, the river was toxic, the air quality was dangerous, and the promised jobs had dried up anyway. I watched my community pay the price for someone else's profit. It made me want to find a better way. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around her eyes that suggested his answer had landed differently than he'd expected. Your resume shows a gap of 3 years. Michael leaned forward. Can you tell us about that? This was it. The moment where he could craft a careful story, minimize the truth, present the version of himself that seemed most employable. But Dr. Webb's advice rang clear, and Nate decided to gamble on honesty. 3 years ago, my wife Catherine died in a car accident. He kept his voice steady, factual. We have a daughter, Sophie. She's 7 now. After Catherine's death, I had to make some hard choices about how to rebuild our lives. I couldn't pursue the career path I'd planned because I needed to be present for Sophie. So I've been working warehouse shifts and doing freelance bookkeeping jobs with flexible hours that let me be there when she needs me. It's not the trajectory I imagined, but it's kept us afloat. The room went quiet. Nate couldn't read their reactions and didn't try. He'd said what was true. That must have been incredibly difficult. Victoria's voice had gone soft, and there was something in her tone that made Nate look at her again. For a moment he saw past the CEO exterior to something raw underneath. How did you manage the grief while caring for a young child? Honestly, Nate gave a short laugh that held no humor. I didn't manage it well. I just survived it one day at a time, sometimes 1 hour at a time. Sophie needed me to function, so I functioned. The grief is still there. I've just learned to carry it differently. Patrick glanced at Victoria, some silent communication passing between them. Then he looked back at Nate. The position we're filling requires someone who can handle high-pressure situations, manage complex financial models, and work collaboratively across departments. Based on your academic record, you clearly have the technical skills. But you've been out of the corporate environment for a while. What makes you think you can handle the demands of this role? Nate felt his spine straighten. This he could answer. With respect, Mr. Brennan, I've spent the last 3 years managing pressure that makes corporate deadlines look simple. I've balanced budgets that had no room for error while my daughter was waiting for dinner. I've solved problems with no resources and no backup. I've made decisions alone that affected another human being's well-being. I've done financial modeling at midnight after working a 10-hour shift because I refused to let my skills atrophy. The question isn't whether I can handle the demands. The question is whether you're willing to see past my circumstances to what I can actually do. The words came out with more force than he'd intended, but Nate didn't regret them. He was tired of apologizing for survival. Victoria's lips curved into what was definitely a smile. Show us. I'm sorry. She turned her tablet around, showing him a complex spreadsheet. This is a real project we're considering. A mixed-use development in Portland designed to revitalize a former industrial site. We've got environmental remediation costs, tax incentive structures, projected revenue streams, and community impact assessments. Walk us through how you'd evaluate whether this is a sound investment. Nate felt something click into place. This he knew. This was the language he spoke fluently even after years away. He pulled his chair closer and began to examine the data, his mind already sorting through the variables. First thing I notice is the timeline. You've got a 5-year projection here, but environmental remediation on industrial sites often takes longer than initially estimated, especially if you find unexpected contamination. I'd want to build in contingency time, maybe 18 to 24 additional months, and account for the carrying costs during that period. He scrolled through more data, his confidence growing. The tax incentive structure is aggressive, which is good, but it's also dependent on hitting specific job creation targets. I'd want to stress test this model against scenarios where you only achieve 60 or 75% of those targets. What's the break-even point? At what threshold does the project go from viable to problematic? What about the community impact piece, Michael asked. How do you factor that into financial analysis? You quantify what you can and acknowledge what you can't. Displacement of existing residents has a cost, both ethical and practical. If you push people out, you create resentment that can manifest in regulatory challenges, public opposition, increased political risk. All of that affects your timeline and your budget. But there's also a qualitative component. What's the value of doing something that genuinely improves people's lives? That's harder to put in a spreadsheet, but it matters for long-term sustainability. He looked up to find all three of them watching him intently. Victoria was leaning back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. You've got a contamination buffer built in here. Nate pointed to a line item. But it's based on preliminary site assessments. I'd recommend bringing in a third-party environmental engineer before you commit. The difference between moderate and severe contamination could swing this project from a 12% return to a loss. It's worth the upfront cost for certainty. They talked through the project for another 20 minutes, Nate fielding questions, offering analysis, occasionally challenging assumptions in the data. He forgot to be nervous. This was what he was good at. Seeing patterns in numbers, understanding the human elements that drove financial outcomes, finding elegant solutions in complex problems. When they finally paused, Nate realized his tie was definitely crooked, and he probably looked disheveled. But he didn't care. He'd shown them what they'd asked to see. That was impressive. Patrick sounded like he meant it. Very impressive. Michael agreed. Your analytical instincts are sharp, and your ability to contextualize financial data within broader social impact is exactly what we're looking for. Victoria had been quiet during the last exchange. Now she stood, and Nate automatically stood as well. She walked around the table, and Nate felt his pulse kick up without understanding why. May I? She gestured toward his tie. Nate blinked, confused. I'm sorry, your tie. It's crooked. May I fix it? He nodded, unable to form words. Victoria stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive, and reached up to straighten his tie. Her fingers were deft, efficient, and Nate found himself frozen, staring at a point just past her shoulder because looking directly at her felt too intense. The moment stretched, her hands on the silk adjusting, smoothing. Nate's heart hammered against his ribs. He was acutely aware of the small distance between them, the warmth radiating from her, the way time seemed to slow and thicken. There. She said it softly, her hands lingering for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Much better. She stepped back, and Nate could breathe again. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps? Or simply acknowledgement of a moment that shouldn't have felt significant but somehow did. Thank you, he managed. We'll be in touch, Mr. Sterling. Victoria's professional mask slid back into place. Soon. Nate left the building in a daze. He made it 3 blocks before he had to stop and sit on a bench, his hands shaking with what felt like adrenaline crash, but was something more complicated. The interview had gone well. Better than well. They'd been impressed with his analysis. They'd engaged with his ideas. Patrick and Michael had practically telegraphed approval, but none of that was what had his heart racing. Victoria Ashford had fixed his tie. Such a small gesture. Meaningless, really. The kind of thing someone might do for a colleague without thinking twice. Except it hadn't felt meaningless. It had felt intimate in a way that made no sense, a breach of the professional distance that should have existed between them. Nate pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and tried to calm down. He was reading too much into a kind gesture from a woman who probably just had an eye for detail and a habit of fixing things out of place. But her hands had been warm, and she'd looked at him like she saw something beneath the surface. And for the first time in 3 years, Nate had felt something other than numb grief when someone touched him. His phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Walsh. "Sophie's at my place. Picked her up from the bus. No rush coming home." "How did it go?" "It went well," he texted back. "Really well. I'll be there in an hour. Thank you." He had an hour to himself. An hour to sit on this bench and watch the city move around him. An hour to think about what came next. If he got this job and something in Victoria's expression suggested he might, everything would change. Financial stability, health insurance for Sophie, the ability to stop living month to month, a career path that actually used his education, but also working for a woman who had somehow shaken something loose inside him with a simple touch. Being in proximity to whatever that feeling was day after day, learning to navigate professional boundaries when he'd forgotten how to navigate anything beyond basic survival. Nate thought about Catherine. 3 years and he could still see her face clearly. The way she'd laughed at his terrible jokes, the fierce intelligence in her eyes, the softness of her hand in his. He'd loved her with everything he had, and when she died he'd assumed that part of him died too. He'd made his peace with that. He was a father now, not a husband. Romance, attraction, connection. Those were luxuries from a previous life that no longer applied. Except Victoria Ashford had fixed his tie, and for 30 seconds, Nathaniel Sterling had felt devastatingly, terrifyingly alive. Sophie was covered in paint when Nate arrived at Mrs. Walsh's apartment. The older woman's eyes twinkled with affection as she explained about the art emergency. Sophie couldn't wait to start her painting. Daddy Sophie ran to him, leaving small paint footprints on the kitchen floor. "Look what I made." She held up paper showing a figure in a suit surrounded by what appeared to be stars or maybe flowers. The interpretation was generous. "It's beautiful." Nate crouched to her level. "Tell me about it. This is you being brave at your interview." Sophie's voice carried that serious tone she got when explaining important things. "And these are all the good things that are going to happen because you were brave." Nate felt his throat tighten. "How do you know I was brave?" "Because you're always brave, Daddy, even when you're scared." He pulled her into a hug, not caring about the paint transferring to his suit. The suit had served its purpose. It had carried him through the interview. It had been witness to Victoria's hands on his tie to the moment when something shifted in a glass conference room overlooking the city. They thanked Mrs. Walsh and walked home through the late afternoon light. Sophie talked nonstop about her day, the art project, the story her teacher had read, the game at recess where she'd been the dragon. Nate listened, asked questions, tried to stay present instead of replaying every moment of the interview. That night, after pancakes and bath time and 2 stories, Sophie finally fell asleep. Nate sat in the living room of their small apartment staring at his phone like he could will it to ring. It didn't, of course. Professional hiring processes took time. He knew that. 3 days later, when his phone finally did ring and Margaret's warm voice said, "Victoria would like to speak with him," Nate's world shifted on its axis once again. "Mr. Sterling." Victoria's voice came through clear and composed. "I wanted to let you know personally that we'd like to offer you the position. The formal offer letter will come through HR, but I wanted to tell you first. Your interview was exceptional. We're all very excited at the prospect of having you join our team." Nate had imagined this moment 100 times over the past 3 days. In his imagination, he'd been smooth, professional, appropriately grateful. In reality, he had to sit down because his knees went weak. "Thank you." His voice came out rougher than intended. "This is incredible. Thank you so much. The thanks isn't necessary. You earned this on merit." There was a pause, and when Victoria continued, her tone was somehow both professional and personal. "I know taking this position will require adjustments with Sophie's schedule. If you need flexibility, we can work something out. We value the whole person here, Mr. Sterling, not just the analyst." The kindness in that statement nearly undid him. "I appreciate that more than I can say. Welcome to Ashford Ventures, Nathaniel. I'll see you Monday." She hung up, and Nate sat in his quiet apartment holding a phone that had just delivered a future he'd stopped believing in. Then he stood and walked to Sophie's room. She was asleep, curled around her worn rabbit, her face peaceful in the dimness. Nate knelt beside her bed and whispered into the darkness. "We're going to be okay, baby girl. We're finally going to be okay." And for the first time in 3 years he believed it might actually be true. Monday morning arrived 3 months after Nate's first day at Ashford Ventures. He woke on the couch with a stiff neck and Sophie curled against him, her purple cast propped on a cushion, a souvenir from her fall from the monkey bars 2 weeks into his tenure, now almost healed, but still purple and covered in signatures from her classmates. She stirred when he moved, her eyes opening slowly. "How do you feel?" "It hurts, but not as bad as yesterday." "That's good. The doctor said it would get better each day." He kissed her forehead. "How about pancakes for breakfast?" "With chocolate chips. If that's what the warrior with the purple cast wants, that's what she gets." They spent the day together in careful domesticity. Pancakes and cartoons, reading books with Sophie tucked under his arm, helping her figure out how to do things one-handed. Around noon the doorbell rang. Nate opened it to find a delivery person holding an enormous basket filled with books, art supplies, puzzles, and a stuffed dragon wearing a purple cape. Delivery for Sophie Sterling. The card read, "For a brave warrior. Wishing you a speedy recovery. Victoria Ashford." Sophie's face lit up when she saw the dragon. "She sent me a present." "She did. Can I call her to say thank you?" Nate hesitated. The request was innocent, but it felt like crossing a line he'd been carefully maintaining. Still, Sophie was looking at him with such hope, and teaching gratitude mattered more than his complicated feelings. "Let me text her first and ask if that's okay." He sent Victoria a message. "The basket is incredibly generous. Sophie wants to call and thank you personally if you have a moment." Victoria's response came within minutes. "I'd love that. Call whenever works for her." Nate dialed, his heart beating too fast, and Victoria answered on the second ring. "Hello, hi, it's Nathaniel. I have someone who wants to talk to you." He handed the phone to Sophie, who held it carefully with her good hand. "Miss Ashford, this is Sophie. Thank you so much for the presents. The dragon is my favorite. I named him Victor because it sounds like Victoria." Nate could hear Victoria's warm laugh through the phone. Sophie continued talking, describing her purple cast, explaining that the doctor said she was brave, asking if Victoria had ever broken her arm. Whatever Victoria said made Sophie giggle. They talked for another few minutes before Sophie said, "Do you want to talk to my daddy again?" She handed the phone back to Nate. "She's wonderful." There was something in Victoria's voice that made his breath catch. "Thank you for letting her call. It made my day. Thank you for the basket. It was really thoughtful. I remember being 7 and having a cast. It's scary and boring at the same time. I wanted her to have distractions." A pause. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay. Tired, but okay. Take care of yourself too, Nathaniel. Sophie needs you healthy." After they hung up, Sophie looked at Nate with wide eyes. "I like her, Daddy. She's nice and she laughs real. Laughs real." Some grown-ups do a pretend laugh when kids talk to them. But Miss Ashford's laugh was real, like she actually thought I was funny. They returned to work on Thursday. Sophie went back to school with strict instructions to be careful, and Nate arrived at the office to find a stack of messages from team members asking about Sophie and offering to help with any workload that had piled up. Jennifer had covered his most urgent deadlines. Patrick had rescheduled the client meeting Nate had missed. Victoria stopped by his office mid-morning, leaning in the doorway in a way that was becoming familiar. "How's the patient already trying to do cartwheels despite explicit doctor's orders not to? I've created a 7-year-old who thinks a purple cast makes her invincible. That's actually a sign of good parenting. Confidence and resilience are valuable traits even when they give you heart attacks. Especially then." Victoria's smile faded into something more serious. "I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have a few minutes?" Nate's stomach tensed. "Of course." She came in and closed the door behind her, which immediately made him nervous. Victoria rarely closed doors. She sat in the chair across from his desk, her posture more hesitant than he'd ever seen. "I've been thinking about the other day." about what happened when Sophie got hurt and how you had to leave in the middle of the presentation. I'm really sorry about that. Don't. Victoria's voice was firm. Don't apologize. You did exactly what you should have done, but it made me realize that we need to formalize some policies around family emergencies and flexible scheduling. You shouldn't have to apologize or feel guilty for being a parent. Victoria, you already give me more flexibility than any job I've ever had, which is why I want to make it official policy for everyone. I'm proposing a new benefits package to the board: enhanced parental leave, emergency child care assistance, flexible hours for parents, and a fund for unexpected medical expenses. I should have implemented this years ago, but I needed the push. Your situation gave me that. Nate stared at her. You're restructuring company policy because of me. I'm fixing an oversight that should have been addressed from the beginning. Your situation just illuminated it clearly. She met his eyes. You've given me a lot, Nathaniel. Not just good work, though, that's been exceptional. You've reminded me why I started this company, to create a place where people's worth isn't measured only by their availability or their ability to pretend their lives outside work don't exist. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know that the changes are coming, and they're partly because you had the courage to be honest about your life instead of hiding it. After she left, Nate sat at his desk, feeling the weight of her words. Every interaction with Victoria seemed to reveal another layer, showing him someone who wielded power as responsibility rather than privilege. He was gathering his things at 6 when he nearly collided with someone in the hallway outside Victoria's office. An older man in an expensive suit with cold eyes that assessed Nate with unsettling precision. Nathaniel Sterling. Not a question, a statement. Nate's professional smile faltered. I'm sorry. Have we met Richard Blackwood, board member? The man extended his hand with the kind of firm grip that felt like a test. I make it a practice to know everyone Victoria hires, especially at your level. Something in the way Blackwood said Victoria's name, familiar, almost possessive, made Nate's instincts prickle. I appreciate the company's thoroughness. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sterling. Unusual name in finance circles. Though I knew a Catherine Sterling once, brilliant compliance officer at Meridian Financial. Before the accident, Nate's blood went cold. That was my wife. Was it Blackwood's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried an edge Nate couldn't quite identify. Small world. Catherine and I worked on several projects together. Her ethical standards were remarkably inflexible. She believed in doing things right, even when doing things right cost the company significant opportunities. Blackwood adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate precision. I remember a particularly lucrative development deal she refused to approve. Environmental violations, she said. The project collapsed. Meridian lost the contract. Several investors, including myself, lost considerable capital. Nate forced himself to keep his voice steady. I'm sure she had good reasons. I'm sure she did. Blackwood's gaze sharpened. Interesting that you've ended up here at Ashford Ventures. Victoria does have a talent for finding people with strong ethical convictions. I hope your tenure here proves more advantageous than your wife's time at Meridian. Before Nate could respond, Blackwood nodded curtly and walked away, leaving Nate frozen in the hallway. The encounter had lasted less than 2 minutes, but every word had felt deliberate, weighted with meaning Nate couldn't quite parse. Catherine had cost Blackwood money, significant money, and now Blackwood sat on the board of the company, employing her widower. Coincidence? Or something more calculated? Nate couldn't shake the unease as he rode the subway home. He wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, the product of 3 years spent waiting for the next disaster. But something in Blackwood's tone, the way he'd mentioned Catherine's inflexibility, the pointed comment about Nate's tenure, it all felt like a warning wrapped in courtesy. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Nate found himself researching Richard Blackwood, investment banker, board positions at 3 major firms, reputation for aggressive profit maximization. And there, buried in a 5-year-old Business Journal article, was the mention Meridian Financial's collapsed waterfront development deal Environmental violations discovered during compliance review, investor losses exceeding $40 million. Catherine's work. Her refusal to approve something that would have poisoned a community's water supply. And Blackwood had been the lead investor. Nate closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his living room listening to Sophie's soft breathing from her bedroom. He thought about telling Victoria, then dismissed it. What would he say? A board member mentioned my dead wife and made vaguely ominous comments. It sounded like paranoia. Besides, he was probably reading too much into it. Blackwood was just making conversation, however awkwardly. Nothing more. The next few weeks settled into a new rhythm. Sophie's cast became part of their routine along with the parade of friends signing it at school and Sophie's growing collection of stories about what people thought had happened. The official version fell from monkey bars was apparently boring, so Sophie had created elaborate alternatives involving dragon rescues and superhero training. At work, the Detroit project moved into implementation phase, and Nate found himself working closely with Victoria on strategic decisions. They fell into an easy collaboration, finishing each other's thoughts, anticipating concerns, pushing each other toward better solutions. Friday brought the team lunch. Jennifer had mentioned 12 analysts gathering at a Thai restaurant 2 blocks from the office. Nate found himself seated between Jennifer and Michael Foster, who specialized in environmental impact assessments. The conversation flowed easily, work gossip mixed with personal stories, genuine laughter. "So, how's your first month been?" Jennifer passed him the pad Thai. "Honestly, better than I imagined. This is the first job I've had where I don't feel like I'm constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop." "That's because Victoria doesn't believe in shoes dropping," Michael said. "She believes in clear communication and treating people like adults. It's revolutionary, really." "Has she always been like that?" Nate tried to sound casual. "As long as I've been here, and that's 4 years. Jennifer took a sip of her water. "I know she had a pretty intense career before starting Ashford Ventures. Word is she left Goldman Sachs after they pressured her to approve an investment that would have displaced thousands of people from affordable housing. She refused, they pushed back, and she walked away from a 7-figure compensation package. She chose ethics over money." Nate said it quietly. "Every time." Michael confirmed. "That's why working here feels different. The mission isn't just rhetoric. It's real." The following week, Nate was deep in analysis of the solar storage project when the numbers finally clicked into place. The startup's financial projections weren't just optimistic, they were mathematically impossible. He'd spent days trying to make the model work, searching for variables he might have missed, but the conclusion was inescapable. He was working through the data for what felt like the 100th time when Victoria appeared in his doorway. It was Thursday evening, almost 6, and most of the office had cleared out. Burning the midnight oil. Nate looked up. "Just trying to make sense of the solar project. Something's not adding up. Show me." Victoria moved into his office and Nate turned his monitor so she could see. He walked her through the analysis, the investor commitments that didn't match the capital requirements, the projected revenue streams that assumed market adoption rates. No comparable technology had ever achieved the timeline for profitability that defied basic mathematics. "They're not lying exactly, but they're being wildly optimistic to the point of delusion. If we invest based on these projections, we'll lose money. Probably a lot of it." Victoria studied the screen, her expression serious. "What's your recommendation?" "Walk away from the current deal structure. If we're interested in the technology itself, we could offer a smaller investment with more oversight and realistic expectations. But partnering with management that's either incompetent or dishonest, that's a disaster waiting to happen. Even though walking away means we might miss out on breakthrough technology, even then. Because if the technology is as good as they claim, someone else will figure out how to commercialize it properly, and if it's not, we'll have avoided lighting money on fire." Nate paused, suddenly aware of how close Victoria was standing. "Unless you disagree with that assessment." "I don't." Victoria's voice was quiet. "I wanted to see if you'd have the courage to recommend we walk away from something promising because the fundamentals are wrong. A lot of analysts get seduced by the exciting narrative and ignore the math. The math doesn't lie. People do." Victoria smiled and Nate felt something respond in his chest. Exactly. I'm going to take your recommendation to the board. This was a test, Nathaniel. And you passed. She glanced at her watch. It's after 6. Why are you still here? Sophie's at a friend's house for dinner. I've got another hour before I need to pick her up. How is she fully recovered? The fact that Victoria remembered that she asked it shouldn't have meant so much. She's great. Bounced back like kids do. She's actually been asking about where I work. I think she's having trouble picturing what I do all day. Bring her by sometime. I'd love to meet her. The offer was casual friendly, exactly what a good boss might say. But something in Victoria's eyes made it feel like more. She'd like that. He said it carefully. She's been painting pictures of me at work. They're mostly abstract impressions of someone in a suit surrounded by papers, but I'm told they're very accurate. Victoria laughed, and the sound did something dangerous to Nate's heart. I'd love to see them. I'll bring one in. They stood there for a moment, the office quiet around them, the city lights beginning to glow outside the window. Nate felt the pull again, that attraction he'd been trying to ignore, to rationalize away. Victoria must have felt something too, because she took a small step back, her expression becoming more guarded. I should let you get back to work. Good analysis, Nathaniel. Really good. After she left, Nate sat in his office trying to focus on the spreadsheet, but his mind kept drifting. The way Victoria had said his name, the warmth in her laugh, the moment when their eyes had met, and something electric had passed between them. He was in trouble. Deep trouble. Because his boss wasn't just intelligent and fair and ethical, she was also beautiful and kind, and saw him in a way that made him feel visible for the first time since Catherine died. What Nate didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Richard Blackwood had begun his campaign the day after their hallway encounter. The board meeting happened on a Thursday morning while Nate was deep in Detroit project analysis. Victoria presided with her usual efficiency, walking through quarterly results, upcoming initiatives, personnel updates. Before we adjourn, Blackwood's voice cut through the closing remarks. I'd like to raise a concern about our recent hiring practices. Victoria's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her pen. What concern? Richard Nathaniel Sterling, hired 3 months ago as senior financial analyst, a position typically requiring 10 years of corporate experience. Mr. Sterling's resume shows a 3-year gap and primarily warehouse employment. His qualifications are unconventional at best. Dr. Webb's recommendation was exceptional. Patrick spoke up. And Sterling's work has been outstanding. His Portland analysis alone saved us from a costly mistake. I'm not questioning his analytical skills. Blackwood's tone remained measured, reasonable. I'm questioning the process. A candidate with significant resume gaps hired unusually quickly, receiving projects well above typical entry level. It creates an appearance of favoritism. Are you suggesting I show favoritism in hiring decisions? Victoria's voice stayed calm, but something dangerous flickered in her eyes. I'm suggesting we ensure all employment decisions follow consistent protocols. For instance, did you know Sterling's late wife Catherine worked at Meridian Financial, that she was directly responsible for blocking a major investment deal? I'd backed Blackwood, let the words settle. The deal's collapse cost Meridian and several board members' portfolios over $47 million. The room went silent. That was 5 years ago. Victoria said it quietly. And has no bearing on Nathaniel Sterling's qualifications for this position. Doesn't it? Or does it explain why a warehouse worker with a connection to someone who cost us money suddenly finds himself in a senior role working closely with the CEO Blackwood? Let the implication hang in the air. I'm simply suggesting we maintain proper oversight, track his projects closely, ensure there are no conflicts of interest developing. Michael Foster shifted uncomfortably. Richard, that seems like a reach. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. Blackwood's smile was thin. I'm exercising appropriate fiduciary responsibility. Surely we all agree that's important. Victoria held his gaze for a long moment. Noted. If there's nothing else, we're adjourned. But as the board members filed out, Blackwood lingered near the door, and Victoria knew with cold certainty this wasn't over. This was just the opening move. She sat alone in the conference room for several minutes after everyone left, staring at her reflection in the polished table surface. Blackwood had just fired a warning shot and she hadn't seen it coming. The problem was he wasn't entirely wrong. She had hired Nate quickly. She had given him high-level projects. And if she was being brutally honest with herself, her interest in him had crossed professional boundaries weeks ago. But that didn't make him unqualified. It didn't make her decision wrong. And it certainly didn't give Blackwood the right to weaponize a dead woman's ethics against her widower. Victoria pulled out her phone and typed a quick email to her assistant. I need a full review of Richard Blackwood's voting record on hiring decisions for the past 3 years, and his investment portfolio conflicts of interest with any companies we've declined to fund. If Blackwood wanted to play corporate politics, she'd remind him that she hadn't built this company by backing down from fights. That night after Sophie was asleep, Nate found himself researching Victoria Ashford again. Not company information this time, but her personal history. There wasn't much. A few old articles about her Goldman Sachs resignation, written with the skeptical tone journalists use when someone does something that seems too principled to be believed. A brief mention in a profile about successful female entrepreneurs. An interview from 6 years ago where she'd said something that stuck with him: I'm not interested in building wealth for its own sake. I'm interested in proving that financial success and social responsibility can coexist. What he didn't find were any mentions of family relationships, personal life. Victoria Ashford seemed to exist only as CEO, only as the driving force behind Ashford Ventures. It made Nate wonder what losses had shaped her, what grief had taught her to separate her public and private selves so completely. 3 months into his tenure at Ashford Ventures, Nate found himself in an impossible situation. Professionally thriving while emotionally unraveling. Grateful for stability while terrified by the pull he felt toward a woman he couldn't have. They were reviewing construction timelines in her office one evening when Victoria's phone rang. She glanced at it, and something shuddered in her expression. I need to take this. I'm sorry. Of course. Nate started to stand, but she gestured for him to stay. She answered, her voice cool and professional. Mother, this isn't a good time. A pause. No, I'm not coming to the gala. We've discussed this. Another pause, longer this time. I'm aware of your disappointment. I've been aware of it for 15 years. Nate pretended to study the documents in front of him, but he couldn't help overhearing Victoria's side of the conversation. Her tone was controlled, but he could hear the tension underneath. Because I don't want to spend an evening being paraded around like a show pony for your friends to evaluate my life choices. Victoria's jaw tightened. I built a successful company based on actual values rather than just accumulating wealth. If that embarrasses you, that's your problem, not mine. She listened for another moment, then said simply, Goodbye, Mother, and ended the call. The silence that followed was heavy. Victoria sat very still, her expression carefully blank in a way Nate recognized from his own mirror, the look of someone trying very hard not to feel. I'm sorry. Her voice was quiet. That was unprofessional. It was human. You don't have to apologize for having a complicated relationship with your mother. Victoria looked at him, surprise flickering across her face. How did you... I recognized the tone. My father and I haven't spoken in 5 years. He thought Catherine and I were making a mistake getting married so young, having Sophie when we were still in school. After Catherine died, he called to say he'd been right, that I'd ruined my life with poor choices. I hung up and haven't answered his calls since. I'm sorry. That's awful. So is being judged by your own mother for building something meaningful. For what it's worth, what you've created here, it matters. It matters to me. It matters to everyone who works here. And it matters to all the people whose lives are better because of the projects we fund. If she can't see that it's her loss. Victoria's eyes were bright, and for a moment Nate thought she might cry. But she blinked, and the moment passed, leaving only a soft vulnerability that made his heart ache. Thank you. Sometimes I forget that the work is enough, that I don't need external validation to know I'm doing something worthwhile. We all forget that sometimes. It's why we need people to remind us. They held each other's gaze across the desk, and Nate felt the air between them charged with something electric. Then Victoria caught him staring not at her eyes now, but at her lips, and her breath hitched audibly. If you keep staring at my lips like that, her voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, I'll forget why this is a bad idea. Maybe. Nate's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it. Maybe it's not a bad idea. The words hung between them, dangerous and honest. Victoria stood abruptly. It's late. You should go home to Sophie. Nate recognized the dismissal for what it was, self-protection. He stood gathering his papers. If you ever need to talk about family stuff, I'm a good listener. And I'm very familiar with the particular pain of parental disappointment. I'll remember that. But as Nate left her office, he wondered if she actually would. Victoria Ashford seemed to have mastered the art of being present for others while keeping her own struggles private. 2 weeks later, the company announced the annual retreat. Ashford Ventures took the entire staff to a resort in the Catskills for a long weekend of team building and strategic planning. It was optional, and Nate had initially planned not to go. Leaving Sophie for a whole weekend felt impossible. But Mrs. Walsh had insisted she'd love to have Sophie stay with her, and Jennifer had convinced him that the retreat was important. Plus, it's genuinely fun. Victoria believes in actual rest and team bonding, not just trust falls and corporate nonsense. Sophie had been excited about her sleepover, chattering about making cookies and staying up late. So Nate found himself on a charter bus heading north with 40 colleagues, trying not to feel guilty. The resort was beautiful, nestled among mountains showing summer green. The first evening was casual dinner and drinks, people breaking into small groups. Nate found himself on the deck overlooking the lake with Jennifer, Michael, and Patrick watching the sunset paint the water gold. Victoria appeared around 8, changed from her usual business attire into jeans and a soft sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. She moved through the groups easily, and when she reached their cluster, she settled into the empty chair beside Nate with a glass of wine and a visible exhale of relief. I'm officially off duty. For the next 48 hours, I'm just Victoria, not CEO Victoria. Is there a difference? Michael asked, grinning. I'd like to think so. CEO. Victoria has to make hard decisions and maintain professional distance. Regular Victoria just wants to relax and enjoy good company. They talked for hours. Someone started a bonfire and people drifted toward it. Nate found himself sitting on a log beside Victoria, both of them staring into the flames. This is nice. Her voice was soft. I forget sometimes that building community is as important as building profits. You've built both. That's rare. It's lonely sometimes, Victoria admitted. Being responsible for everyone's livelihoods. Knowing that my decisions affect real families. The weight of it. I imagine it is. Do you ever feel lonely? Victoria asked, turning to face him. Even when you're with Sophie? The question was intimate in a way that should have made Nate deflect. Instead, he answered honestly. All the time. I love her more than anything but adult conversation connection. I didn't realize how much I needed that until I came to work for you. For Ashford Ventures, I mean. No. Victoria's eyes held his. I think you meant what you said. The next day brought structured activities, and Nate found himself in a small group with Victoria working through complex business scenarios. She was different here, more playful, quicker to laugh. At one point, they ended up in a heated debate about risk assessment that had everyone else watching. You're too cautious, Victoria argued. Sometimes you have to make the leap before you can see the landing, and sometimes you have to build the landing before you jump. Calculated risk is different from recklessness. They were both grinning, the argument playful rather than serious. You two think exactly alike while thinking you're complete opposites. Jennifer laughed. That evening brought a formal banquet with speeches about company achievements. Nate was shocked when Victoria called his name for the Excellence in Analysis Award. Nathaniel Sterling joined us less than 6 months ago, but his impact has been profound. He brings not just technical skill, but moral clarity and deep humanity to every analysis. He reminds us that behind every financial model are real people whose lives will be affected by our decisions. That perspective is invaluable. Nate accepted the award, a glass sculpture, and a generous bonus, feeling exposed and honored. As he returned to his seat, Victoria caught his eye and smiled, and Nate felt the truth crystallize sharp and undeniable. He was in love with her. Not just attracted, not just grateful, actually deeply in love with Victoria Ashford. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like finally admitting a truth he'd been avoiding for months. Later that night, unable to sleep, Nate found himself walking along the lake shore under a sky full of stars. He'd spent the past hour trying to logic his way through the impossible situation. Victoria was his boss. The power imbalance made any romantic overture inappropriate, and he had no idea if she felt anything beyond professional respect. For all he knew, he was projecting his own feelings onto neutral interactions. He was still standing by the lake when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Victoria approaching, wrapped in a cardigan, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Couldn't sleep either. Too much in my head." "I know the feeling." Victoria moved to stand beside him, both of them facing the dark water. "I saw you leave the bonfire. Wanted to make sure you were okay." "I'm fine. Just needed some air." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to water lap against the shore. Then Victoria said quietly, "That thing you said yesterday, about feeling lonely even when you're with Sophie. I understand that more than you might think." Nate glanced at her. "You feel lonely even running a company full of people? Especially then. Being responsible for everyone means maintaining distance. You can't be too close to people whose livelihoods depend on your judgment. It's isolating." She paused. "Until recently, I'd made my peace with that isolation. Told myself it was the price of leadership. What changed recently?" Victoria turned to look at him, and even in the darkness, Nate could see the vulnerability in her expression. "You did." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Nate's heart was pounding. "Victoria, I know I shouldn't say this." Her voice was steady despite the tremor underneath. "I know it's inappropriate and complicated and probably a terrible idea, but I'm tired of pretending I don't feel it. 3 months ago, you walked into my conference room, and I fixed your tie, and something shifted. Every day since I've been trying to convince myself it was just professional admiration. But it's not. It's more than that. And I think you feel it too." Nate couldn't breathe. "I do." The words came out rough. "I've felt it since that interview." "But Victoria, you're my boss. The power dynamic I know. Believe me, I've thought about nothing else for weeks. The ethical implications, the potential for harm, the risk to both our careers." She wrapped her arms around herself. "But I also know that I've never felt this way about anyone, and I'm tired of letting fear make all my decisions." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't know what the answer is, but I think we need to acknowledge what's happening instead of pretending it doesn't exist." Victoria's voice was stronger now. "I'm saying that I care about you, Nathaniel. Not just as an employee, but as a person. And I think you care about me too. I'm in love with you." The confession tumbled out before Nate could stop it. "I've been trying not to be trying to convince myself it's just gratitude or anything other than what it actually is. But I can't lie anymore. I'm in love with you, Victoria, and it terrifies me." Victoria closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers. "It terrifies me too. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being terrified means it matters enough to be worth the risk. What about the company? The ethics concerns? We'll figure it out. Transparently, carefully, with proper oversight. I won't let this compromise your position. But Nathaniel, I can't keep pretending I don't want this, that I don't want you." She was so close now that Nate could feel her breath. Every rational thought told him to step back, but his heart was screaming at him to close the gap, to stop being afraid. He kissed her. Softly at first, tentative, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands tangling in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like coming home after years of being lost. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Victoria rested her forehead against his. "We should talk about what this means." "We should. But maybe not tonight. Tonight, can we just have this?" "Yes." They stayed by the lake for another hour, talking in quiet voices about everything and nothing. Victoria told him about her childhood, growing up wealthy but emotionally impoverished parents who valued status over substance. Nate shared more about Catherine, about the accident and the grief, and learning to live in a world that no longer made sense. "I thought I'd never feel this way again." After Catherine died, it felt like that part of me died too. But you didn't. No, I didn't. He pulled her closer. I'm still scared, though, of losing this, of losing you, of Sophie getting attached and then I'm not going anywhere. Victoria's voice was firm. I don't make commitments lightly, Nathaniel. If we're doing this, I'm all in. But you're right that we need to think about Sophie. She comes first. She always comes first. Then we answer her questions honestly. We don't hide this, but we're careful. Victoria pulled back to look at him. I want to meet her properly, not as your boss, but as someone who cares about her father. Is that okay? She already likes you. She talks about you all the time. The nice lady who sent her the dragon. Who laughs real. Victoria smiled. Laughs real. I like that. They finally returned to the resort around midnight, parting in the hallway with a kiss that promised more while acknowledging the need for discretion. Nate fell asleep feeling lighter than he had in years, despite the complications that waited on the other side of this weekend, despite Richard Blackwood's veiled threats and the board's growing scrutiny, despite everything that could go wrong. For tonight he had this. He had Victoria's admission that she felt it too. He had the memory of her hands in his hair, and her lips against his, and the impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, they could figure out a way to make this work. And that was enough. The retreat bus pulled back into the city Sunday evening, and Nate spent the entire ride staring out the window, replaying the lake confession in his mind. Victoria sat 3 rows ahead, maintaining professional distance, but twice their eyes met in the reflection of the darkened glass, and something electric passed between them. Monday morning brought the reckoning they'd both known was coming. Victoria called him into her office at 9, closing the door with deliberate care. She looked different than she had by the lake hair pulled back in its severe bun. Charcoal suit perfectly pressed every inch the CEO, but her eyes held the same vulnerability he'd seen under the stars. We need to talk about Friday night. Nate nodded, his heart already hammering. I know. What happened between us was real. Her voice was steady despite the weight of what she was saying, and I meant everything I said. But we can't move forward without addressing the ethical implications. She pulled out a folder and Nate recognized the company's employee handbook. There's a clause about workplace relationships requiring HR disclosure. We need to file paperwork, establish oversight protocols, ensure there's no perception of favoritism or abuse of power. Victoria met his eyes. I won't let this compromise your position, but we have to do this right. What does that mean practically? It means your projects get reviewed by Patrick as well as me. It means we document every professional decision with clear rationale. It means we're transparent about our relationship with the people who need to know. She paused. And it means you have the option to transfer to a different department if you'd prefer not to report directly to someone you're involved with. Is that what you want? Victoria's answer was immediate. But I want you to have the choice. I don't want you to feel trapped or pressured. Nate thought about it for all of 3 seconds. I don't want to transfer. I love the work I'm doing. I love working with you. We just need to make sure we're doing it ethically. Then we file the disclosure paperwork today. Victoria pulled out the forms. Fair warning, this will go to HR and to the board. There will be questions. Some people won't be happy about it. Blackwood. Especially Blackwood. But I'd rather deal with scrutiny than hide something that matters this much. They spent the next hour filling out forms, documenting their relationship timeline, proposing oversight structures. It felt simultaneously absurd and necessary, reducing something as profound as what they'd shared to checkbox bureaucracy. When they finished, Victoria looked at him with something like relief. Thank you for being willing to do this properly. Thank you for not asking me to choose between you and my integrity. The smile she gave him was worth every complicated form. The disclosure hit HR by Tuesday morning and the board by Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday, Nate could feel the shift in how certain people looked at him. Some colleagues seemed genuinely happy. Jennifer gave him a knowing smile and a thumbs up. Others were more reserved, watching him with calculation. Patrick stopped by his office Wednesday afternoon and closed the door. So, Victoria. Nate braced himself. Yeah, I'm going to be blunt. This complicates things. There are board members who already questioned your hiring. This gives them ammunition. I know. But I've worked with Victoria for 6 years, and I've never seen her compromise her principles for anything. If she says she wants oversight and transparency, she means it." Patrick's expression was serious but not unkind. "My job now is to make sure that oversight is real. Your work gets reviewed by me with the same scrutiny I'd give anyone else. Maybe more. Can you handle that?" "Yes." "Good. Because your analysis has been excellent and I don't want to lose that because of perception issues." Patrick stood. "Just keep doing what you've been doing. Let the work speak for itself." After he left, Nate sat at his desk feeling the weight of scrutiny settle onto his shoulders. Every decision he made now would be examined for bias. Every success would be questioned as favoritism. Every failure would be used as evidence he'd never deserved the position. The only answer was to be undeniably excellent. Thursday brought the first direct attack. Nate was in a meeting about the Detroit project when Richard Blackwood appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Sterling, might I have a word?" The room went quiet. Nate recognized a power play when he saw one. Of course. He followed Blackwood into the hallway, acutely aware of eyes watching through the glass conference room walls. "I've been reviewing your employment file." Blackwood's tone was conversational, but his eyes were cold. "Interesting reading. 3-year employment gap, minimal corporate experience, yet somehow you've been given high-profile projects and now have a personal relationship with the CEO. Some might say the timeline is suspicious. Some might say my work stands on its own merit. Does it? Or does it just appear meritorious to someone with a vested interest in your success?" Nate felt his jaw tighten. "My analyses have been reviewed by Patrick Brennan, Michael Foster, and multiple external consultants. The Portland project recommendations saved the company $7 million. The Detroit environmental assessment prevented a regulatory nightmare. If you have specific concerns about my work quality, I'm happy to address them." Blackwood smiled thinly. "I'm sure you are. I'm simply noting that appearances matter in business, Mr. Sterling. The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as actual impropriety. Something to consider." He walked away, leaving Nate standing in the hallway with his hands clenched and his heart racing. That night, Nate told Victoria about the confrontation while they sat in her office after everyone else had gone home. "He's trying to rattle you." She said it with certainty. "Don't let him. It's working." Victoria reached across the desk and took his hand. "The work you do is exceptional. Patrick knows it. Michael knows it. I know it. Blackwood's opinion doesn't change reality. But he's on the board. His opinion matters. Less than you think." She squeezed his fingers. "I've been doing some digging into Blackwood's voting record. He's blocked 3 diversity hires, opposed 2 environmental initiatives, and pushed for deals with companies that later faced ethics violations. I'm building a case that his judgment is compromised by his own conflicts of interest. Be careful. If he finds out you're investigating him, I'm always careful. But I won't let him weaponize our relationship to undermine either of our positions." The crisis came 2 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon. Nate was in the middle of a conference call when his phone lit up with 3 missed calls from Sophie's school. His blood went cold. "I need to take this." He muted the call and dialed the school back with shaking hands. "Mr. Sterling, this is Principal Morrison. Sophie's fine physically, but there's been an incident." "What happened?" "Some children were teasing her about not having a mother. It escalated and Sophie pushed one of them. Nobody's hurt, but we need you to come pick her up." Nate was already grabbing his jacket. "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He sent a quick message to Victoria Sophie, "Emergency leaving now," and ran for the subway. His mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Sophie pushing someone meant she was hurting badly. She was the gentlest kid he knew. The school's administrative office felt oppressively small. Sophie sat in a chair looking tiny and defiant, her face blotchy from crying. When she saw Nate, her composure cracked. "Daddy." He pulled her into his arms, not caring about the principal watching. "What happened, sweetheart?" Sophie's voice was muffled against his chest. "Emma said I was lying about having a mom who died. She said I probably made it up for attention, so I pushed her." Principal Morrison cleared her throat. We have a zero-tolerance policy for physical altercations. Sophie will need to serve an in-school suspension tomorrow. She was defending her mother's memory. Nate kept his voice even despite the anger burning in his chest. A child questioned whether her trauma was real, and she reacted. That deserves conversation and support, not punishment. Mr. Sterling, I understand this is difficult, but rules. They were walking to Nate's car when Victoria's sedan pulled into the parking lot. She got out, still in her business suit, and walked directly to them. I got your message. Her eyes went to Sophie. Are you okay? Sophie looked up at this woman she'd only spoken to on the phone, and something in her small face crumpled. She said my mom wasn't real. Victoria knelt down on the pavement without hesitation, putting herself at Sophie's eye level, her perfectly tailored suit crumpling against the asphalt. Your mom was absolutely real, and she loved you very much, and anyone who says otherwise is wrong. How do you know? Because your dad talks about her. I can hear how much she mattered in every word, and I can see how much she loved you in the amazing person you've become. Sophie stared at her for a long moment, then threw her arms around Victoria's neck. Victoria held her one hand gentle on Sophie's back and met Nate's eyes over his daughter's shoulder. In that moment, Nate fell in love with her all over again. They got ice cream. Victoria texted her assistant that she was unavailable for the rest of the day, and the three of them sat in a booth at Sophie's favorite shop, while Sophie alternated between eating cookies and cream and explaining exactly what Emma had said and why it was wrong. Victoria listened with complete attention, asking questions, validating Sophie's feelings, never once making her feel like her emotions were too big or too complicated. You were right to be angry, Victoria said finally. But pushing someone even when you're angry makes things worse, not better. Do you know what I do when people make me angry? What I prove them wrong. Not with my hands, but with my words and my actions. I show them they're mistaken by being so undeniably right they can't argue anymore. Sophie considered this seriously. That sounds hard. It is. But it works better than pushing. After ice cream, Victoria walked them to Nate's car. Sophie was already half asleep in the back seat when Victoria touched Nate's arm. I left a board meeting for this. Her voice was quiet. Blackwood will use it against me. But I don't care. She needed someone to show up, and I wanted to be that person. Nate felt something expand in his chest. You're amazing. You know that, right? I know I care about both of you. More than is probably wise. That night after Sophie was asleep, Nate got a text from Patrick. FYI. Blackwood raised concerns at today's board meeting about Victoria's judgment. Used her leaving the meeting as evidence of compromised priorities. Wanted you to know. Nate stared at the message, feeling dread settle into his bones. This was exactly what Victoria had predicted. Blackwood was using their relationship as a weapon. He called her. I just heard about the board meeting. Patrick told you? She sounded tired. It's fine. I expected it. Victoria, he's trying to undermine your position. Because of me. He's trying to undermine my position because he's been trying to do that for years, and now he thinks he has ammunition. This isn't your fault. What did you say when he brought it up? That my personal life doesn't compromise my professional judgment. And that leaving a meeting to support an employee's family emergency aligns perfectly with the company values I've always championed. That if he has concerns about my leadership, he's welcome to call for a vote of confidence. You called his bluff. I called his bluff. And he backed down. For now. But he's not done. No, he's not done. Victoria paused. Nate, I need to ask you something. Anything. If this gets worse, if Blackwood really pushes this and it becomes a choice between your position or mine, what do you want me to do? The question was so absurd, Nate almost laughed. You've built this company from nothing. You employ 40 people whose families depend on your leadership. You fund projects that actually make the world better. If it comes down to a choice, there is no choice. I walk away and you stay. That's not what I want. I know, but it's what's right. The silence that followed was heavy with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Victoria spoke. I'm going to fight for both of us. I'm not giving you up without a battle, and I'm not letting Blackwood destroy what I've built. But Nathaniel, you need to understand this is going to get harder before it gets better. I know. And you're still in, I'm still in. Completely. The battle came to a head 3 weeks later. Blackwood had spent the interim building his case methodically. Questions about Nate's hiring process, implications about Victoria's judgment, whispers about impropriety that spread through the company like poison. Victoria countered by being aggressively transparent. She published her investigation into Blackwood's conflicts of interest, the times he'd pushed for investments in companies where he held personal stakes, the environmental projects he'd opposed that would have competed with his other holdings, the pattern of prioritizing profit over the company's stated values. The board meeting where everything exploded was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. Nate wasn't invited, but he sat in his office trying to work while knowing his entire future was being decided 3 floors above. At 10:47, his email pinged. A message from Patrick with just 2 words. "Come now." Nate's hands shook as he walked to the boardroom. The door was open, and he could hear raised voices inside. Completely inappropriate to have this discussion without Sterling present. Victoria's voice steel underneath the polish. "You're debating his employment. He deserves to defend himself. This is a board matter, not an employee matter." Blackwood's response was ice cold. "It's both. And I'm calling him in." Victoria appeared in the doorway and gestured for Nate. He walked into the boardroom feeling like he was entering a trial. 8 board members sat around the table. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked curious. Blackwood looked triumphant. "Mr. Sterling." Victoria's voice was formal, professional. "Mr. Blackwood has raised concerns about your qualifications and the circumstances of your hiring. I'd like you to address them directly." Nate took the empty seat, forcing himself to meet Blackwood's eyes. "What would you like to know?" Blackwood leaned forward. "Let's start with your resume gap. 3 years of warehouse work and freelance bookkeeping. Why should we believe you're qualified for a senior analyst position?" Nate had prepared for this. "Because during those 3 years I continued my education independently. I completed 2 online certifications in sustainable finance. I published 3 papers in academic journals on environmental economics, and I did financial modeling for nonprofits that had 0 margin for error. I learned to do exceptional work under impossible constraints. That's a qualification that matters. You were hired unusually quickly. I was hired based on Dr. Webb's recommendation and my interview performance. I was given a project during that interview and completed an analysis in real time that identified $7 million in potential losses. Patrick Brennan can confirm that." Patrick nodded. "The Portland analysis was graduate-level work, and your relationship with Ms. Ashford Blackwood's tone sharpened." "When did that begin?" "After my hiring." Nate kept his voice steady. "We disclosed it immediately and established oversight protocols. My work is now reviewed by multiple people to ensure objectivity. If you have concerns about quality, examine the results." "I have examined the results." Blackwood pulled out a folder. The Detroit Environmental Assessment, the Solar Storage Recommendation, the Portland Investment Analysis. All projects where you worked closely with Ms. Ashford, all resulting in decisions that aligned with her known preferences for environmental and social considerations over pure profit maximization, all resulting in better outcomes than we would have achieved otherwise. Victoria's voice cut through. The Detroit assessment prevented regulatory fines that would have cost us $12 million. The solar storage recommendation saved us from investing in a company that failed 8 months later. The Portland analysis. The Portland analysis cost us a potentially lucrative deal. Blackwood interrupted. It cost us a deal that would have destroyed a community water supply. Nate found himself standing without meaning to. My wife Catherine was a compliance officer who blocked one of your projects for the same reason. She refused to approve something that would have poisoned people for profit, and you lost $47 million. That's why you're really here, isn't it? This isn't about my qualifications. It's about revenge. The room went silent. How dare you? Blackwood's face flushed red. I'm exercising my fiduciary duty to this company. You're exercising a grudge, And you're using my relationship with Victoria as cover for it. This is exactly the kind of emotional instability that concerns me. Blackwood turned to the other board members. We have an employee with minimal qualifications who happens to be romantically involved with our CEO, showing aggression in a board meeting, making wild accusations. He's right. Everyone turned to look at Michael Foster, who'd been silent until now. I've worked with Nate for 6 months. His analyses are consistently the best I've seen. He challenges assumptions, catches errors other people miss, and genuinely cares about whether our investments help or harm communities. That's not favoritism. That's excellence. And Richard, we all know you've opposed every environmental initiative this company has proposed. Your agenda isn't about protecting the company. It's about protecting your personal portfolio. Blackwood stood. This is absurd. Actually, Victoria's voice was calm, almost pleasant. Michael's right. I've documented 17 instances where your board votes aligned with your personal financial interests rather than company values. Which brings me to my motion. She pulled out papers and distributed them around the table. I'm proposing we amend our board member conflict of interest policies to require full disclosure of all outside investments and automatic recusal from votes where personal financial gain might bias judgment. These amendments would apply retroactively to decisions made in the past 3 years. Blackwood went very still. Additionally, I'm proposing we establish clear criteria for board membership that include alignment with company values around environmental and social responsibility. Board members who repeatedly vote against those values without compelling financial justification would be asked to resign. She met Blackwood's eyes. Would anyone like to second these motions? I second. Patrick's voice was firm. All in favor. 7 hands went up. Only Blackwood's stayed down. The motion passes. Victoria's voice held no triumph, just finality. Richard, given your voting record and the conflicts I've documented, I'm asking for your resignation from this board. You can't do this. I just did. You have until Friday to submit your resignation voluntarily, or I'll call for a removal vote on Monday. Your choice. Blackwood looked around the table, seeing no allies, and his expression twisted into something ugly. You'll regret this. All of you. This company's bleeding heart priorities will destroy it eventually. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out. The door closing behind him felt like the end of a siege. Victoria turned to Nate. Mr. Sterling, thank you for your candor. The board stands behind both your employment and your relationship. You're dismissed. Nate nodded, not trusting his voice, and left the room on shaking legs. He was back at his desk when Victoria appeared in his doorway an hour later. Can we go somewhere? Her voice was carefully controlled. Somewhere that isn't this building. They ended up at the coffee shop where Nate had sat after his first interview, the place where he'd tried to process what Victoria's touch had awakened in him. Now they sat across from each other with untouched lattes, both too wrung out to speak. Finally, Victoria said quietly, I thought I might lose everything today. But you didn't. We didn't, she corrected. If you hadn't stood up to Blackwood, if you hadn't been willing to call out his real motivations, I'm not sure the board would have backed me. You would have been fine. I don't know. I've been thinking about what you said, about how, if it came to a choice, you'd walk away. Victoria's eyes were bright. It terrified me because I realized I didn't know what I would choose, the company I've built or the person I love. You love me, I love you. The words were simple, definitive. I'm in love with you, Nathaniel. So completely it scares me, and I never want to face a choice between you and this company again. Then we make sure you never have to. Nate reached across the table and took her hand. We keep being transparent. We keep doing excellent work. We keep proving that what we have doesn't compromise anything. It makes us both better. Can I tell you something? Victoria's voice dropped. When I walked into that school and saw Sophie crying, something in me shifted. I didn't think about board meetings or company politics or professional complications. I just thought about a little girl who needed someone to show up for her. And I wanted to be that person. For her, but also for you. You were. You are. I want more of that. More afternoons getting ice cream and listening to 7-year-old logic about playground justice. More nights where we're too tired to talk and just sit together. More of building something real instead of just managing a company. Victoria met his eyes. I want a life with you and Sophie, not just a relationship, a family. Nate felt his throat tighten. I want that too. So, where do we go from here? Nate thought about it. Carefully, honestly. I think we start introducing you into Sophie's life more deliberately. Not as my boss who sends presents, but as someone who matters to me. We have dinners together. We take her to the museum. We let her see what we are to each other so it's not a shock. She already knows something's happening. Kids are perceptive. Then we confirm it. Age appropriately. Honestly. And the company. We keep doing what we're doing. Excellent work. Total transparency, proving every day that what we have doesn't compromise our judgment. For how long? As long as it takes. Nate squeezed her hand. I'm not going anywhere, Victoria. Whatever scrutiny comes, whatever challenges I'm in this. Completely. They sat in the coffee shop for another hour, planning logistics and discussing Sophie and imagining a future that no longer felt impossible. When they finally left, Nate felt lighter than he had in weeks. The months that followed weren't easy, but they were good. Sophie adjusted to Victoria being around more with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who'd learned early that families came in different shapes. The first real dinner together was awkward. Sophie watching Victoria with curiosity, while Nate tried too hard to make everything perfect. But when Sophie spilled her milk and Victoria laughed instead of flinching, something relaxed in all of them. At work, Nate threw himself into proving that his relationship with Victoria didn't compromise his judgment. When he disagreed with her initial instincts on a project, he said so publicly and backed his position with data. When his analysis supported her position, he documented every step of his reasoning so thoroughly that Patrick started joking about whether Nate was writing academic papers or business memos. There were colleagues who remained skeptical. There were projects where Nate had to work twice as hard to prove his recommendations weren't biased. But there were also victories. The team lunch where Jennifer loudly announced that anyone who had a problem with Nate and Victoria could take it up with her. The client meeting where Nate's environmental impact assessment impressed a notoriously difficult investor. The afternoon when Patrick pulled him aside and said simply, "You've proven yourself. Anyone who still doubts your qualifications isn't paying attention." Sophie painted a picture titled, "Daddy's Friend Victoria Who Makes Him Smile Real," and insisted it go on the refrigerator. Victoria framed a copy for her office. 6 months after the board meeting, Nate and Sophie moved out of their small apartment into a townhouse with an actual yard. Victoria helped them pack, and Sophie insisted Victoria's opinion was needed on every decision. "Should the dragon go in my new room or the living room?" "Your room definitely," Victoria said seriously. "Dragons need their own space. What about Dad's sad suit?" "The one he wore to the interview," Nate intervened. "We're keeping that." Why, Sophie was genuinely confused. "It makes you sad." "Because it's part of how we got here. Sometimes we keep things that remind us where we came from." Victoria met his eyes over Sophie's head, and something wordless passed between them. She understood. The suit was a marker, a before and after line. Keeping it meant honoring the journey. That evening, after Sophie was asleep in her new room larger than their entire old apartment's living room, Nate and Victoria sat on the back porch watching fireflies drift through the summer darkness. "I have something to ask you." Victoria's voice was nervous in a way he rarely heard. "Okay, not tonight, but soon. I want to do this properly." Nate turned to look at her. "Do what properly?" Victoria pulled a small velvet box from her pocket and set it on the table between them. She didn't open it. "I've been carrying this for 2 weeks waiting for the right moment. But I realize tonight that I'm waiting because I'm terrified you'll say no." "Victoria, let me finish." She took a breath. "I know this is complicated. I know we're still navigating what it means to be together while working together. I know Sophie has to come first, and that any decision about our future has to include her input. But Nathaniel, I also know that I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about wanting to build a future with you, with both of you." She opened the box. Inside was a simple platinum band, elegant without being ostentatious. I'm not asking tonight. I'm telling you that I'm going to ask. Soon. And I wanted you to know it's coming so you can think about it. Talk to Sophie about it. Make sure it's what you both want. Nate stared at the ring, his vision blurring. Can I tell you something? Anything. I've been trying to figure out how to ask you the same question for the past month. Victoria's laugh was half sob. Are you serious? Completely. I was going to wait until Sophie's birthday next month, ask her permission first, then ask you. But Victoria, my answer is yes. It's been yes since that night by the lake. It's been yes since you knelt on the pavement at Sophie's school. It's yes. She kissed him then, soft and sure, and when they broke apart she was smiling through tears. So we're engaged. We're engaged. But we're doing this. Sophie's way. Together. Deal. They told Sophie the next morning over pancakes. Victoria had stayed over for the first time, sleeping in the guest room, and Sophie had been delighted to find her at breakfast. Sophie, we need to talk to you about something important. Nate set down the spatula. Victoria and I care about each other very much, and we were wondering how you'd feel if Victoria became part of our family. Officially. Sophie looked between them, syrup dripping from her fork. Like if she moved in here? Eventually, yes. And if your dad and I got married, if she became your stepmom. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and Nate's heart hammered. Then she said, would she still be Victoria? Or would I have to call her Mom? Victoria answered before Nate could. You can call me whatever feels right to you. Victoria is perfect. Or you could call me V if you wanted something shorter. Or if someday you wanted to call me Mom, that would be the greatest honor of my life. But there's no rush and no pressure. We figure it out as we go. Sophie nodded slowly. And she'd come to school stuff like when Dad can't make it? I'd come to everything I possibly could, even when your dad can make it. If you wanted me there. And she'd help with homework. Victoria smiled. I'm pretty good at math and terrible at spelling, so we'd make a good team. Sophie turned to Nate. Do you love her? More than I thought I could love anyone except you. Does she make you happy? She makes me happy. Sophie looked at Victoria. Do you love him? Even though he's bad at cooking and sometimes he forgets to buy milk? I love him, even with all his faults, which for the record include being bad at cooking and forgetting to buy milk. Sophie took another bite of pancake. Okay then, you can get married. Just like that, Nate asked. Just like that. Sophie shrugged. I already told Emma at school you were probably going to be my stepmom anyway. She said stepmoms are mean in movies but nice in real life. Is that true? Stepmoms are just people. Victoria's voice was gentle. Some are mean, some are nice, just like regular moms. I promise to do my best to be the nice kind. Okay. Sophie returned her attention to her pancakes. Can we get a dog? Nate and Victoria looked at each other. We'll talk about it, Nate said. That means yes, Sophie informed Victoria. When grown-ups say, we'll talk about it, it means yes, but they want to pretend they're still making the decision. Victoria laughed. I'm learning so much. They set the wedding date for March, 1 year after Nate's interview, 4 years after Catherine's death. The symmetry felt right, like closing one chapter and opening another. The planning was a family affair. Sophie had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. The venue had to have a garden because gardens were romantic. The cake had to have chocolate because vanilla was boring. And she, Sophie Sterling, would be wearing a purple dress because purple was her color, and if anyone disagreed, they could take it up with her dragon. Victoria and Nate agreed to everything. The wedding was small. Sophie in her purple dress with a crown of flowers, Mrs. Walsh crying in the front row, Patrick and Jennifer and Michael, and the team from Ashford Ventures. Dr. Webb, who'd written the recommendation that started everything. No board members. Blackwood had resigned 3 days after the vote, and Victoria had made it clear the new board members would be chosen for values alignment, not just financial acumen. Nate stood at the altar watching Victoria walk toward him, and the past 4 years compressed into a single moment of gratitude. For Catherine, who'd taught him about integrity even when it cost everything. For Sophie, who'd kept him tethered to life when he'd wanted to drift. For Dr. Webb, who'd believed in him. For Victoria, who'd seen past his crooked tie to the person underneath. Victoria reached him and took his hands, and Sophie stood between them, holding the rings. The officiant smiled. We're gathered here today to celebrate not just the joining of two lives, but the creation of a family. Nathaniel, Victoria, and Sophie have asked to exchange vows that reflect this truth. Nate spoke first, looking at Victoria, but including Sophie in his gaze. I promise to be brave enough to let you love me, to build a life with you that honors where we've been and embraces where we're going, to be your partner in all things, and to remember that being loved isn't a luxury, it's a gift I'll never take for granted. Victoria's vows were simple. I promise to show up. For you, for Sophie, for the life we're building. Even when it's complicated. Especially when it's complicated. I promise to prove every day that love and integrity aren't opposing forces, they're the same thing. Sophie had insisted on her own vow written on purple construction paper in her careful second-grade handwriting. I promise to try not to forget my homework and to let you guys have alone time even though it's boring, and to love you both even when you make me eat vegetables. The officiant had to pause while everyone laughed. When they kissed, Sophie cheered louder than everyone else combined. The reception was held at the same Catskills resort where they'd confessed their feelings by the lake. Someone had strung lights between the trees, and there was dancing and cake, chocolate and vanilla, a compromise, and Sophie telling anyone who would listen about how she'd known from the beginning that Victoria was perfect for her dad. Nate found himself by the lake later in the evening, Victoria beside him in her wedding dress. I keep thinking about that night, she said softly. When you told me you were in love with me and I thought I might be having a heart attack from sheer terror. And now I'm still terrified. But it's the good kind of terror, the kind that means I have something worth being scared of losing. You're not going to lose me. I know. Victoria leaned into him. That's the amazing part. I actually believe it. What neither of them had seen on that night by the lake months ago was the figure standing in the shadows near the elevator bay. Richard Blackwood had also attended the retreat. Board members were always invited, though few came. He'd been returning from a late walk when he'd spotted them by the water's edge, silhouettes against starlight unmistakably intimate. He'd watched long enough to confirm what he'd suspected since that hallway encounter weeks earlier. The CEO and her surprisingly qualified analyst, the dead wife's widower, and the woman who'd hired him despite his unconventional background. Blackwood had pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, typing quickly. Observed VA and NS in compromising position, 11:47 p.m. Lakeside. Witnesses none. Relationship clearly extends beyond professional boundaries. Recommend immediate board review of hiring practices and potential conflicts of interest. He'd saved the note and smiled thinly in the darkness, already planning his attack. This changed everything he'd thought. But Blackwood had underestimated two things: Victoria's willingness to fight for what mattered, and Nate's refusal to apologize for survival. The evidence Blackwood thought would destroy them had only forced them to fight harder, to be more transparent, to prove that love and integrity could coexist. Now Blackwood was gone, and they were still standing. Nate thought about this as he stood by the lake on his wedding night, Victoria's hand in his. He thought about all the ways the past 4 years could have gone differently, all the moments where despair could have won. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For fixing my tie, for seeing past the resume gap, for showing up at Sophie's school, for fighting for us even when it was complicated, for loving me when I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again." Victoria turned to face him, fully taking both his hands. "You don't need to thank me for any of that. Loving you isn't work, Nathaniel. It's the easiest thing I've ever done." Behind them, someone called that it was time to cut the cake. They walked back to the reception, hand in hand, toward Sophie's laughter and the warm glow of lights, toward the future they'd built from honesty and courage and the willingness to risk everything for something real. Later that night, after the reception ended and Sophie was asleep at Mrs. Walsh's house and Nate and Victoria were finally alone in their hotel room, Victoria asked one more question. "Do you ever wish things had been different? That we'd met some other way without all the complications? Nate thought about it honestly. No, because the complications made us both who we are. Catherine's death taught me about grief and resilience. Your company taught you about values and integrity. Blackwood's attacks taught us both about fighting for what matters. If we'd met some easier way, we wouldn't be the people who fell in love by that lake. So, you're saying all the hard parts were worth it. I'm saying the hard parts made the good parts possible. Nate pulled her closer. I'm saying I'd go through every difficult moment again if it meant ending up here with you. Victoria kissed him, and it tasted like promise and hope and the particular sweetness of happiness that's been earned rather than given. 4 years after losing everything, Nathaniel Sterling had finally stopped just surviving. He was living again, fully, completely without holding back. He had Sophie, who'd grown from a frightened 7-year-old into a confident child who knew her mother's love even in absence. He had work that mattered, that used his skills to make the world incrementally better. He had Victoria, who'd taught him that being vulnerable wasn't weakness, it was the bravest thing a person could do. And tomorrow morning they'd wake up as a family. Not the family he'd imagined when he was 25 and the world made sense, but a family built from loss and courage and the stubborn insistence that joy was possible even after grief. 3 years ago he'd stood in a glass conference room with a crooked tie and shaking hands, hoping for a job that would let him survive. Instead, he'd found Victoria Ashford, who'd fixed his tie and changed his life. And that was more than enough. It was everything.